The morning of my daughter's wedding, I ironed my own dress. Not because no one offered. My son-in-law's mother had a suite at the hotel with a steamer and a mimosa bar and at least 4 women fussing over things that didn't need fussing. She'd invited me up. I'd declined politely, twice, and then I stopped answering the texts. I ironed my dress in my room at the Hampton Inn on Route 9, the same one where I'd stayed when I drove down to help my daughter look at venues 2 years ago. Back then, she'd held my hand in the parking lot of the first place and said, "Mom, I don't care where we have it as long as you're there." I'd believed her. I'd believed a lot of things then. My name is Dolores. I'm 63 years old. I worked for 31 years as a physical therapist, the last 14 of them running my own practice out of a converted Victorian on Maple Street in Dunmore, Pennsylvania. My husband Frank died 11 years ago, 2 weeks after our younger son graduated high school, which is the kind of timing that teaches you something brutal about how life doesn't care about your plans. I raised 2 kids mostly on my own after that, and I did it without asking anyone for anything I couldn't eventually pay back. I say that not to make myself sound noble. I say it because it matters for what came later. My daughter Simone married a man named Ashford in June. Ashford came from money in the way that people who come from money never quite explain. It was just there, always had been, assumed to always be. His mother Vivienne had opinions about flowers and about seating charts, and about what kind of champagne was appropriate for a Saturday afternoon ceremony, and she had never once asked mine. That was fine. Vivienne wasn't the problem. The problem started 8 months before the wedding, on a Tuesday evening when Simone called me while I was eating leftover chicken soup and watching the news with the volume too low. She said, "Mom, we wanted to talk to you about the budget." I turned the TV off. She and Ashford had put together a spreadsheet. I know this because she told me, and because later, when I asked to see it, there was a pause long enough that I understood I was not meant to see it. The venue they'd chosen held 220 people. The catering alone was going to run close to $40,000. There was a florist, a photographer who apparently had a waiting list, a string quartet for the ceremony, and a DJ for the reception, a dessert table in addition to the cake, and a photo booth. Simone talked for a long time. She talked about how Ashford's family was covering certain things. She didn't specify which things, and how they had savings of their own, which was true. They did. Though I also knew that most of what they'd saved had gone toward a down payment on a house in a neighborhood where the HOA fees alone were more than my first apartment's rent. Then she said, "We were hoping you could contribute around $30,000. I set my spoon down. I said, $30,000. "We know it's a lot," she said. "But you've always been so generous, and we just want the day to be perfect, and Vivienne is already putting in so much." I said I'd think about it. I did think about it. I thought about it for 3 weeks. I thought about the practice I'd built and the retirement account I'd been carefully feeding since Frank died. I thought about the fact that I was 63 and not 63 with a pension. I was 63 with savings and Social Security and the hope that my knees held out for another few years. I thought about what $30,000 meant to me versus what it meant to a family that served veuve cliquot at their son's engagement dinner. I also thought about what Simone hadn't said. She hadn't said, "We'd love for you to be part of this." She hadn't said, "Whatever you're comfortable with." She had said $30,000 with a number, like a line item. I called her back, and I said I could do 10. There was a silence on the line that I have replayed many times since. It wasn't a surprise silence. It was a recalibrating silence. She said, "Oh, then I'll have to talk to Ashford." She called back 2 days later and said that 10 would be fine, and her voice was warm and easy, and the conversation moved on quickly, and I almost convinced myself the whole thing had been fine. It wasn't fine. I knew it wasn't fine the way you know a filling has come loose before you can feel it with your tongue. Over the next several months, I watched myself become adjacent to the wedding. Not excluded. No one ever excludes you explicitly. That would be rude, and these were not rude people, but moved to the edges. The engagement party at Vivienne's house in Chestnut Hill, I was not asked to co-host. The bridal shower, planned and executed by Simone's future sisters-in-law, I was invited to but not consulted about. When Simone asked me to come dress shopping, I went, and I sat in a chair that was slightly off to the side. And when she came out in the dress she ultimately chose, I was the last one to say anything because two of Ashford's cousins were already crying, and by the time the noise settled, Simone was looking at Vivienne. I smiled. I said it was beautiful. It was beautiful. I went home and I sat in my kitchen and I ate toast for dinner because I didn't feel like cooking. Here is what my children knew about me. I was their mother. I was a physical therapist. I drove a 10-year-old Subaru and kept the heat at 68 in winter, and I made a good pot roast. I went to church on Easter and Christmas. I liked mysteries, the British kind, and I grew tomatoes in the backyard. Here is what my children did not know. That Frank and I, in the years before he got sick, had invested steadily and quietly in 3 commercial properties in the Scranton area. A small office building, a strip plaza, a warehouse unit that we'd bought cheap because the previous owner hadn't maintained it, and Frank had spent 2 weekends a month for 4 years fixing it himself, and then we'd leased it to a regional HVAC company, and it had paid us back, and then some. Frank managed all of it. When he died, I inherited the managing. I had to learn things I didn't know about cap rates and triple net leases, and what a property manager actually does, and when it's worth paying one. I made mistakes. I also made money. I never told my children because Frank and I had decided early on that we didn't want them growing up with expectations. I'd watched people I knew raise children who assumed, who counted on things that hadn't been offered, and I'd watched what happened when the thing they counted on didn't appear. I didn't want that for Simone or for my son Derek, so we kept it quiet. The properties were an investment, not a lifestyle. We lived on our salaries. We drove practical cars. After Frank died, I kept it quiet for different reasons. I was a widow. A widow who owns commercial real estate is a different thing than a married woman with a portfolio. I had watched what happened to my neighbor Gloria when her husband passed and the relatives started circling. I was not going to be that. So I lived on Maple Street and drove my Subaru and kept the heat at 68 and said yes when Simone needed $10,000 for a wedding. 3 months before the wedding, Simone called to discuss what I would be wearing. She said it gently, the way she'd learned to say things she might need to take back, carefully, with an exit. She said Vivienne's family would mostly be in blush and champagne tones, and she wanted to make sure we complemented each other, the mothers. Did I have something, or did I need to go shopping? I said I had something. I did not have something. What I had was a navy dress I'd worn to Derek's college graduation 6 years ago that no longer fit across the shoulders. I went to the mall on a Saturday, and I walked through 4 stores, and the saleswomen were polite in that specific way that polite people are when they're not entirely sure you can afford what they're selling. I bought a dress at the 5th store, pale gold, structured, the kind of thing that looks simple until the light hits it. It cost $480, and I wore it home to try it with my shoes, and I sat in it in the kitchen for an hour, thinking about nothing in particular. The wedding was on a Saturday in June. I drove myself down on Friday afternoon. I did not stay at the hotel block. Vivienne had arranged because the rates were $190 a night, and the Hampton Inn was $74, and I am a practical woman. The rehearsal dinner was at a steakhouse. Ashford's family had bought out for the evening. I sat next to Derek, who'd come with his girlfriend Pamela, and we ate and we were pleasant, and at some point Vivienne gave a toast and mentioned Ashford's late grandfather, and then mentioned her own role in raising a son of integrity and character, and I raised my glass when everyone else raised theirs. No one asked me to speak. I had written something, in case. I'd written it on the back of an envelope 3 weeks before, and then typed it out and carried it in my purse. I did not take it out of my purse. I went back to the Hampton Inn and I called Derek from the parking lot. He said, "How are you holding up, Mom?" I said, "Fine." He said he'd noticed I seemed a little quiet. I said I was always a little quiet, which he knew was not entirely true, but was also not entirely false. The morning of the wedding, I ironed my dress and I did my own hair, and at 10:45 I drove to the venue, a converted estate outside the city with horse pastures visible from the ceremony lawn. The photographs before the ceremony were choreographed in the way that photographs are now, with a coordinator telling everyone where to stand. There were photographs of Simone with Ashford's sisters. There were photographs with Ashford's sister. There was a long sequence of Simone with the bridesmaids, and then a sequence of Simone alone, and then a sequence of Simone and Ashford. And then someone said, "Mother of the bride." And I stepped forward, and there were 3 photographs, maybe 4. And then the coordinator said, "Wonderful. Let's move to the wedding party." And I stepped back. I stood near a magnolia tree, and a woman I didn't know handed me a glass of water, and I drank it. The ceremony was at 2. Simone was lovely. She was the loveliest thing I had ever made or done in my life, and she walked down that aisle, and she was happy in the way that a person is happy when they don't yet know what is in front of them, and I understood that, and I loved her so thoroughly it was almost grief. The reception was in the estate's ballroom. Dinner was at 6. I found my table on the seating chart. Round table 8, near the left side of the room, with Derek and Pamela, 2 of Simone's college friends, and 2 of Ashford's cousins I'd never met. Table 8 was not at the back of the room. It was not the worst table. It was the 4th or 5th table from the head table, and if you did not know what that meant, you would not think anything of it. I knew what it meant. Vivienne sat at the head table. I ordered the salmon. Derek kept my water glass full without me asking, and I appreciated that more than I could say at the time. Ashford's cousin to my left was a dentist from Philadelphia, and we talked about the cost of malpractice insurance, which was oddly the most relaxing conversation I had all evening. The toasts were at 7:30. Simone's maid of honor spoke first, a lovely girl named Tessa, who'd known Simone since sophomore year and who told a story about a road trip that made the room laugh in the easy, genuine way that means a room trusts a speaker. Ashford's best man spoke. Ashford's father spoke. Vivienne stood up and held a glass of champagne and said that she had always hoped for a daughter-in-law like Simone, and the room gave her a long, warm applause. Derek leaned over and said quietly, "Mom, do you want me to say something to Simone?" I said no. What I said to him exactly was, "Don't, she's happy. Let her be happy." He looked at me for a moment, my son, who has Frank's eyes and my stubbornness, and he nodded. I danced once with Derek to a song I didn't recognize. Pamela took a photograph of us that she texted me later, and which I keep on my phone now. I danced once more with an uncle of Ashford's who asked me if I lived nearby, and when I said Dunmore, he told me he'd passed through Dunmore once in 1987. We agreed it was a nice area. At 9:30, I said goodbye to Simone. She hugged me and she smelled like roses and hairspray, and she said, "I'm so glad you were here, Mom." I held her for a moment longer than she probably expected. Then I let go, and I smiled, and I meant both things. I drove back to the Hampton Inn in the dark with the radio on, some station out of Philadelphia playing songs from the 90s. I sang along to one of them, quietly, to myself. In my room, I took off the gold dress and hung it carefully. I sat on the edge of the bed. I did not cry, I'm not sure why not. I had come close a few times during the day, but I didn't. What I did was open my laptop and I looked at things. I looked at flights. I looked at something I had been looking at, off and on, for several months. There is a small town in the hill country of Texas, west of Austin, called Fredericksburg. And it has been a place I've thought about since Frank and I drove through it on a road trip years ago. And I said, half joking, "I could live here." And Frank said, "You could live anywhere you decided to," which was one of the truest things he ever said to me. Fredericksburg has a main street with old German limestone buildings and wineries on the roads outside of town and lavender farms in June that look like something a person would paint. It has a hospital. It has a physical therapy clinic that I had looked at the website of a number of times. I had been talking carefully with a commercial real estate broker in Austin for 6 weeks. One of my Scranton properties, the Strip Plaza, I had been ready to sell for 2 years. The market had been slow. In the past month, it had moved. I had also, 2 months before the wedding, spoken with an attorney. I had updated my will. I had structured things differently than they had been. My estate, when the time came, would not be divided the way my children might assume it would be. There were causes I cared about. A scholarship fund at the community college in Scranton, where I'd gotten my associate's degree before transferring, and a clinic in Harrisburg that did free PT for veterans, and a few other things. I had thought about it for a long time. These were not angry decisions, they were clarifying ones. I had not told Simone or Derek any of this. What I had told Simone, 2 weeks before the wedding, was that I loved her, and that I was proud of who she was, and that I hoped she and Ashford built something real. I meant all of it. I wrote it in a card, and I also said it on the phone. Whatever happens between parents and children, I didn't want her walking into her marriage carrying something I hadn't said. I closed the laptop at 11:30. I washed my face and brushed my teeth, and I lay in the dark. I thought about Frank the way I do late at night in hotel rooms, which is the only time I fully permit myself to. I thought about what he would have said about all of it. He would have said something dry and short and precisely right, because that was how he was. He would not have told me what to do. He would have asked me what I wanted, and waited, and trusted me to know. What I wanted, I decided in that Hampton Inn room on Route 9, was to stop arranging myself around other people's assumptions. That was all. It was not dramatic. It was not revenge. It was a very quiet decision that felt, in the dark, like finally putting down something heavy. 6 weeks after the wedding, I drove down to Fredericksburg on a Thursday. I told no one. I stayed 3 nights in a bed, and breakfast run by a woman named Dolly, who made kolaches in the morning and kept rescue dogs in the yard. I walked the main street. I drove the back roads in early July with the windows down and the hills golden dry. I went to the physical therapy clinic and introduced myself to the owner, a woman in her late 50s named Sandy, who'd built it over 20 years and was thinking about what came next. We had coffee for 2 hours. I drove back to Pennsylvania and I put the Maple Street house on the market in September. Simone called when she found out. I had told Derek the week before, in person, over lunch, and he had sat quietly and then asked good questions and told me he was glad I was doing something I wanted to do. Simone's call was different. She said, "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" I said, "I'm telling you now." She said, "That house is where I grew up." I said, "I know. I grew up in it too, in a way." There was a long pause. She said, "Is this because of the wedding?" I had thought about what I would say if she asked this. I had practiced it, which I suppose is the honest word. I said, "I've been thinking about this for a long time. The wedding helped me understand what I'd been putting off." She started to say something and stopped. Then she said, "The seating thing. I know it wasn't right. Vivienne did the chart and I should have." "Simone," I said, "it wasn't only the seating." Another pause. A long one. I said, "You're going to be fine. You have a good life. Ashford is a good person. What I need you to understand is that you have your life and I need to have mine, and for a while there, I let those get confused." She said, "I didn't know you felt that way." I believed her. That was the part that was sad, and I let myself feel it. She hadn't known because I hadn't told her, and I hadn't told her because for years I'd thought that making myself easy was the same as being a good mother, and it isn't, and I had learned that late. I said, "Now you know." "That's not a bad thing," she cried a little. I let her. I didn't apologize and I didn't backtrack. We stayed on the phone for a while after she stopped crying and talked about other things, ordinary things, and it was the most honest conversation we had had in years. I moved to Fredericksburg in February. Sandy and I signed an agreement in November, a gradual transition over 2 years, her stepping back, me stepping in, built in a way that worked for both of us. I sold the Maple Street house to a young family from New York who wanted more space. I watched them stand in the backyard on a cold December afternoon, the 2 parents and their small kids, looking at the dead tomato garden I hadn't cleared yet, talking about what they might plant. I closed the door and drove to Derek's for dinner. My house here is smaller than the one in Dunmore. It has a porch that faces west, and in the evenings the light comes across the hills in a way that still, after 8 months, feels like something I have to brace myself to look at. I have 3 rescue dogs now, which I did not plan, but Dolly had a litter situation in April, and I was not strong. I see patients 3 days a week. Sandy's still there on Tuesdays. We disagree about treatment plans sometimes, and she's usually right, and I tell her so, which seems to surprise her, though it shouldn't. I've been wrong about things before. I am not too old to know that. Simone and Ashford visited in March. She stood on my west-facing porch at dusk, and she was quiet for a long time. And then she said, "I get it, Mom." I didn't say anything. I just handed her a glass of wine and we watched the light change. She asked me, later, over dinner, whether I was happy. I thought about it honestly, the way I try to do with questions that matter. I said, "I'm closer to it than I've been in a long time." She reached across the table and put her hand on mine, and neither of us said anything. And that was the right answer too, and we both knew it.